In all my years of listening to parents talk about their children, there's one sound I've learned to recognize instantly. It's not yelling, it's not even words. It's that sharp, sudden silence right before a parent's patience snaps completely in two. It usually starts small, a request ignored, a tone that feels just a bit too confident. A teenager who answers with that expressionless face that seems to say, I heard you, I just don't care right now. And somehow, that is the moment everything in the room changes temperature. What I found fascinating is how quickly the mind rewrites the story. It stops being about homework not done or chores left untouched. Suddenly, it becomes something heavier: disrespect, rebellion, lack of appreciation. After everything I do for you. And that's where the fire starts. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like to admit: parental rage is rarely born in that exact moment. That moment is just the match. The fuel has been building quietly all day, sometimes all week. Work pressure, financial tension, sleep deprivation, the endless mental checklist of responsibilities no one else sees. By the time the child talks back, the system is already overloaded. So when the explosion happens, it feels justified in the moment, almost logical, almost necessary. But if you look closely enough afterward, there's usually a pause, and then that quiet thought: why did I react like that over something so small? That question is where everything useful begins, because what I want to explore in this series is not just how to control anger like it's some wild animal that needs locking away. That approach never really works long term. What actually works is something more precise and a bit more uncomfortable: learning how to reframe what your mind is telling you in the exact moment rage begins to rise, and then redirecting that energy before it becomes damage. We're going to break down what is actually happening inside the brain when parental anger spikes, why teenagers seem to trigger it so easily, and most importantly, how a simple shift in interpretation can completely change the outcome of the same situation. Because the goal is not silent parenting, it's not emotional suppression either. It's control without destruction, clarity without explosion, and discipline without emotional aftermath that lingers longer than the original problem. And it all starts with understanding that rage is rarely about the child standing in front of you, even when it feels like it is. When we talk about parental rage, it's easy to imagine it as something explosive and external, like a sudden storm that just appears out of nowhere. But psychologically, that storm has layers, and the first layer sits deep inside the brain, long before any shouting, long before any punishment, long before anyone storms out of a room. At the core of it is something neuroscientists often refer to as an amygdala hijack. That's a fancy way of saying the emotional brain takes over the steering wheel before the thinking brain even realizes there's danger. It's fast, almost automatic, and once it happens, logic becomes a passenger instead of the driver. In that state, a parent isn't responding to the present moment alone. They're reacting to a compressed version of everything that moment represents in their mind. A teenager saying, I'll do it later, doesn't just sound like delay. It can get internally translated as, you don't respect structure, or worse, you don't respect me. And that interpretation is where things get interesting, because teenagers, by design, are not emotionally neutral creatures. Their brains are still developing the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control, long term thinking, and emotional regulation. So, what you often get is a strange collision: a parent reacting from a stress loaded adult brain, and a teenager responding from a brain still learning emotional restraint. It's not a fair match in terms of regulation capacity, which is why conflict escalates so quickly in households that otherwise look perfectly normal from the outside. And here's the part most people miss: the teenager's behavior is not the primary trigger of rage, it's the meaning assigned to that behavior. Let me put it more plainly. Two parents can hear the exact same sentence, I'm not doing it right now, and respond completely differently. One might feel mild frustration and move on. The other might feel disrespected, dismissed, and instantly defensive. The difference is not the child. The difference is the interpretation happening inside the parent's mind within milliseconds. Now, there's another layer underneath this: emotion mirroring. When a parent escalates emotionally, raised voice, sharp tone, rigid posture, the teenager's nervous system often reads that as threat, not guidance. So instead of calming down, the teen either withdraws completely or escalates right back. It becomes a loop. One side increases intensity, the other side reflects it, and suddenly the original issue, homework, chores, responsibility, has completely disappeared from the conversation. What remains is two nervous systems trying to overpower each other. And this is where anger becomes especially deceptive, because anger rarely shows up alone. It often disguises itself as something more socially acceptable in the moment: concern, frustration, disappointment. But underneath, it's usually fear or overwhelm wearing a different outfit: fear of losing control, fear of being ignored, fear that things are slipping in a direction that feels unmanageable. But because fear feels vulnerable, the brain often converts it into anger, which feels more powerful in the moment. So when we say parental rage, what we're really talking about is a layered emotional response where interpretation, stress load, and biological wiring all collide in a very short window of time. And once you start seeing it that way, the conversation shifts. It stops being, "How do I stop being angry?" and becomes something more practical and more powerful. What exactly am I telling myself in the seconds before I react? Now, this is where things start to change in a meaningful way, because once you understand that anger is built on interpretation, you can actually intervene before it turns into action. Most parents assume rage is something that needs to be controlled after it appears. But by that point, you're already negotiating with a fire that has been lit. The real leverage point is earlier, during the internal story your mind is constructing in real time. This is what cognitive psychologists call reappraisal, but I prefer a simpler framing. It's the ability to interrupt the narrative your brain is rushing to complete. Let me give you a familiar scene. A teenager is asked to do something simple, say clean a space, finish an assignment, or respond to a request. Instead of immediate compliance, there's delay, maybe even silence. And in that silence, the parent's mind starts filling the gap. That's disrespect. They're ignoring me on purpose. They don't value what I do. Notice something important. None of those statements are facts. They are interpretations stitched together at speed to explain discomfort. And that's exactly where reframing begins, not by pretending the behavior is fine, but by refusing to accept the first emotional explanation your brain offers. A more regulated internal shift might sound like, "This is resistance, not rejection. This is delay, not defiance. This is a developing executive function, not a personal attack." The point here is not to excuse behavior. It's to prevent emotional escalation from hijacking your response. Because once the brain locks into a personal meaning, "This is disrespect," the body follows. Voice rises, tone sharpens, posture changes, and suddenly, what could have been a simple correction becomes a full emotional event that both sides remember longer than the original issue. Now, here's something even more important. There is a small but critical window between trigger and reaction. It's not long, sometimes just a few seconds, but it exists. And what you do in that window determines whether the situation escalates or stabilizes. Most people miss it because their attention is already forward moving toward correction, punishment, explanation, or control. But emotionally skilled parenting lives in that tiny pause where the story can still be edited. This is also where the body becomes an ally instead of an enemy, because emotional intensity is not just mental, it is physiological. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, muscle tension rises. So, if nothing interrupts that pattern, the mind will simply follow the body into escalation. That's why even a small physical reset matters. A slow exhale, a brief step back, a moment of silence before speaking. These are not symbolic gestures, they are neurological interrupts. They give the thinking brain time to re engage. And when it does, you gain access to options that rage does not allow: tone control, timing, and clarity of message. What's interesting is that when parents consistently practice this kind of reframing, something subtle begins to shift in the household dynamic. The child doesn't just respond to fewer explosions, they begin to adjust their own behavior patterns because the emotional feedback loop loses its volatility. But none of that happens if the internal story is left unchecked. Because once the mind commits to the idea that I am being disrespected, the body will almost always follow through on that belief. And that's why reframing is not just a mindset trick, it's the first real point of control in the entire emotional sequence. Once you've learned to interrupt the internal story, the next challenge is often the hardest one for most parents: what to do with the anger once it's already there. Because let's be honest, reframing doesn't magically delete emotion, it just prevents it from driving the car. The feeling can still exist, the heat can still rise, the frustration can still sit in the chest like pressure. The difference now is whether that energy becomes destructive or simply redirected. This is where many people get stuck. They assume the only two options are either explode or suppress, but both come with consequences. Explosion damages trust and communication. Suppression looks calm on the outside, but builds internal pressure that eventually leaks out somewhere else, often in worse ways and at worse times. So, the more useful question becomes: how do you allow the emotion to exist without letting it take control of your behavior? One of the most effective psychological distinctions here is separating feeling from action. You can feel anger without acting from anger. That separation is not natural at first, it's trained. And it starts by creating a small physical and verbal buffer between impulse and response. For example, instead of immediately responding to a teenager's behavior in the same emotional tone, there is a deliberate pause in expression. Not silence as punishment, but silence as regulation. A reset of pacing, a shift in physical state before words are chosen. Because once words come out in anger, they don't just communicate the message, they carry emotional charge. And that charge is what adolescents remember more than the content itself. Now, redirecting rage is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about converting raw emotional intensity into structured communication. There is a difference between saying something in a heated moment and saying the exact same thing after your nervous system has settled. The message may be identical, but the outcome is not. In a regulated state, correction becomes clearer, boundaries become more consistent, consequences become more proportional rather than reactive, and most importantly, the interaction stops being a battle for emotional dominance and returns to what it should be: guidance. Another important aspect here is timing. Many conflicts escalate not because of what is said, but because of when it is said. Trying to correct behavior at the peak of emotional activation on either side is usually ineffective. The nervous system is not in a learning state during high arousal, it is in a defensive state. That means the most productive conversations often happen after emotional cooling, not during emotional ignition. And here is where something subtle but powerful starts to happen. When a parent consistently avoids emotional escalation, the teenager gradually adjusts too. Not immediately and not perfectly, but over time, the household begins to lose its reactive rhythm. Because emotional intensity is contagious, but so is emotional stability. What many parents discover at this stage is that they don't actually need more force, they need more precision. Less reaction, more intention. Less emotional discharge, more structured response. And once that shift begins, discipline stops feeling like a constant fight and starts becoming something much more sustainable, a system of predictable boundaries rather than emotional collisions. That's the point where parenting begins to feel less like surviving conflict and more like managing it with clarity. At this point, the conversation shifts from what to do in the moment to something more structural, how emotional patterns actually become a long term parenting style, whether we intend them to or not. Because the truth is, no household is neutral emotionally. Every home develops a rhythm. Some are reactive, where tension spikes quickly and resolves unpredictably. Others are more regulated, where expectations and responses feel consistent even when disagreements happen. And that difference is rarely about love or intention. It's about emotional habits that have been repeated long enough to become default settings. What many parents don't realize is that emotional regulation is not just an individual skill, it becomes a household system. When a parent consistently interrupts escalation, reframes interpretation, and repairs after conflict, the entire environment begins to recalibrate. Not instantly and not perfectly, but gradually, the emotional temperature of the home becomes more stable. And stability matters more than intensity in shaping adolescent behavior. Teenagers are highly responsive to emotional predictability. When responses are volatile, sometimes calm, sometimes explosive for similar behaviors, they begin to adjust by either becoming defensive, withdrawn, or strategically compliant. None of those are ideal for long term development. But when emotional responses become more consistent, something interesting happens. The need for testing boundaries aggressively reduces, not because the teenager is suddenly better behaved, but because the system feels less chaotic to navigate. Another important layer here is the shift from reactive parenting to intentional parenting. Reactive parenting is driven by immediate emotional input: what was just said, what just happened, what feels disrespectful in the moment. Intentional parenting, on the other hand, is guided by longer term outcomes. What behavior pattern is being reinforced? What emotional lesson is being absorbed? What dynamic is being repeated? This doesn't mean becoming detached or overly analytical in every interaction. It simply means gradually training the mind to ask a different question in tense moments. What outcome am I reinforcing right now? Because every reaction, especially emotional ones, teaches something. Sometimes it teaches respect, sometimes it teaches fear, sometimes it teaches avoidance, and sometimes it unintentionally teaches escalation. Over time, the goal is not to eliminate conflict. Conflict is part of development, especially during adolescence. The goal is to remove emotional unpredictability from conflict. That means disagreement can exist without emotional volatility. Correction can happen without escalation. Boundaries can be enforced without turning every moment into a psychological standoff. And when that begins to settle in, something very practical emerges. Fewer misunderstandings spiral into major arguments, and more conversations stay within manageable emotional limits. But perhaps the most overlooked shift in this entire process is internal. Parents who work through this pattern often discover that their own stress levels begin to change, not just because the child behaves differently, but because the internal experience of parenting becomes less like constant emotional firefighting. Instead of reacting to every trigger as a separate crisis, there is a growing sense of pattern recognition. You begin to see the structure underneath the behavior rather than just the behavior itself. And that is where emotional control stops being a moment to moment struggle and starts becoming a stable skill set. Not perfect, not effortless, but increasingly intentional. And in parenting, that shift alone can change everything about how discipline, communication, and connection actually feel in daily life. At this stage, the focus naturally shifts to the long term psychological outcome of everything we've been discussing, because emotional regulation in parenting is not just about smoother households, It directly shapes the emotional architecture of the child growing up inside that environment. One of the most consistent findings in developmental psychology is that children and adolescents do not primarily learn from instructions, they learn from patterns. Repeated emotional patterns become internal templates for how relationships, conflict, and authority are understood later in life. So, when a household is dominated by unpredictable emotional reactions, the child doesn't just learn what not to do, they learn how to anticipate emotional volatility. They begin to scan tone, timing, facial expressions, and energy shifts in order to stay ahead of possible escalation. This creates a kind of hyper awareness that can look like compliance on the surface, but internally, it often produces anxiety or emotional withdrawal. On the other hand, when emotional responses are more regulated, even during disagreement, the child's nervous system learns something fundamentally different. Conflict is not a threat to stability, it is a manageable interaction. That distinction becomes extremely important during adolescence, when independence naturally increases and testing boundaries becomes part of psychological development. Now, here's where the parenting impact becomes very practical. A regulated emotional environment reduces what psychologists sometimes refer to as defensive escalation loops. These are the cycles where one person's emotional intensity triggers an equal or higher response in the other person, creating a rapid upward spiral of conflict. When parents consistently model emotional control, even when frustrated, those loops lose momentum. The teenager may still resist, still argue, still test limits, but the interaction is less likely to escalate into full emotional rupture. Instead, what often emerges is something more functional: disagreement without emotional collapse. And that is a crucial developmental skill. Another long term effect is the shaping of emotional self regulation in the adolescent brain. Teenagers are still building the neurological systems that control impulse regulation, frustration tolerance, and delayed gratification. When they repeatedly experience a caregiver who can pause, reframe, and respond rather than react, they are effectively being exposed to live demonstrations of emotional regulation, not lectures, not warnings, demonstrations. And over time, that becomes internalized. But there is also a more subtle shift that happens inside the parent during this process. As emotional reactivity decreases, perception becomes sharper. Situations that once felt like personal attacks start to appear more clearly as developmental behavior: testing, autonomy seeking, emotional immaturity, or simple impulsivity. That reframing does something important. It reduces emotional personalization. And once personalization drops, so does unnecessary anger. At that point, discipline stops being a reaction to perceived disrespect and starts becoming a response to behavior patterns that need shaping. The tone becomes steadier, the boundaries become clearer, and the emotional aftermath of correction becomes significantly lighter. What's interesting is that this doesn't weaken authority, it strengthens it. Because consistency is far more psychologically grounding than intensity. Teenagers may resist structure, but they respond more predictably to it when it is stable, and stability, over time, creates trust, even in disagreement. So, the broader outcome of reframing and redirecting parental rage is not just fewer arguments or calmer conversations. It is the gradual restructuring of the emotional system inside the home, where reactions become less chaotic, communication becomes more functional, and conflict becomes something that can be handled rather than endured. And that is where the real transformation sits, not in eliminating anger, but in changing what anger leads to. When you pull all of this together, the core idea is actually quite simple, even if getting there is not always simple in practice. Parental rage doesn't usually begin as rage. It begins as interpretation layered on top of stress, fatigue, and expectations. A teenager's behavior becomes the trigger, but the emotional meaning assigned to that behavior is what really determines whether things stay controlled or spiral. Once that is understood, three things become the foundation of change. First is reframing, not denying what you see, not excusing behavior, but interrupting the automatic story the mind creates in seconds. This is disrespect. This is defiance. This is personal. Replacing that with more accurate, less emotionally charged interpretations creates space where reaction used to be automatic. Second is redirection. Anger is not the enemy, it's unmanaged expression of it that causes damage. The goal is not to suppress emotion, but to delay action long enough for clarity to return. That pause, even if brief, is where tone, timing, and outcome are decided. It's the difference between correction and conflict escalation. Third is repair, because no one gets this right every time. What matters is what happens after emotional rupture. Repair restores connection without weakening boundaries. It teaches that mistakes in emotion do not equal broken relationships, and that accountability includes adults too. Over time, these three shifts create something bigger than better behavior management. They change the emotional climate of the home. Less unpredictability, less escalation, more structure, more predictability in how conflict is handled. And in that kind of environment, teenagers don't just learn rules, they learn emotional literacy. They observe that intensity does not have to lead to damage, and that disagreement does not automatically mean disconnection. That lesson lasts far beyond adolescence. If you've ever found yourself reacting in ways you later questioned, or watching a simple situation turn into something bigger than it needed to be, you're not alone in that pattern. But patterns are not permanent. They shift through awareness, repetition, and small, consistent changes in how moments are interpreted and handled. I'm genuinely curious how this plays out in real homes. What triggers tend to escalate things faster than expected, and what actually helps you reset in the moment? Share your experiences in the comments. I do go through them, and I may respond where I can. If this resonated with you, like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more grounded, psychology based parenting conversations that focus on what actually works in real life.